Marhaba, shalom, and g'day. Welcome to episode 6 in season 2 of From the Yarra River to the Mediterranean Sea. I'd like to begin this episode with a little thought experiment. Imagine a Shabbat dinner in Caulfield or Dover Heights. The parent is in their 50s, an ardent Zionist who donates regularly to the JNF, attends ZFA events, and was deeply moved by the recent visit of President Herzog to their city, who provided comfort to the Jewish community following the Hanukkah massacre on Bondi Beach. The child, let's say they're in their 20s, a graduate of a Jewish day school, has been protesting that same visit, arguing that Israel's president should be arrested for inciting a genocide in Gaza. How are these two members of the same family meant to share a meal together? Now, for some, this might sound like fiction, but for others, this is a lived reality. And we currently live in an increasingly fractured time where families, many that I know, are having very intense disagreements about the place of Zionism, the place of Israel in their Jewish identity. And many Jewish organizations have been wrestling with this, but there's one particularly one called For the Sake of Argument, whose work I've found to be very impressive. It's led by Robbie Gringras, who made Aliyah from the UK, and Abby Stern, who is American. Both of them have lived in Israel for over 20 years, and their organization For the Sake of Argument recently embarked on a listening tour where they went to the US and they interviewed 30 young Jewish anti-Zionists, and they came up with a report called The Journeys and Destinations of Young Jewish Anti-Zionists. And the report contains many insights that I think would be interesting for both Australian and American Jews. So in the first question of this interview that I had with Robbie Gringras, I asked him what made him want to undertake such a research project. I hope you find the episode meaningful.
For the sake of argument, the work that Abby Stern and myself do, we are interested in empowering folks to have healthy arguments about stuff that's important to them. And so one project we were working on was intergenerational arguments about Israel. And so we received funding to bring together folks who disagreed about Israel across a generational divide and work with them. And as we ran these workshops, we realized two things. One was that it wasn't clear that there is a schism between generations in the Jewish world in the United States. I should say this was just in the United States. It just wasn't clear enough, that distinction, because we found that there were Zionist young Jews, there were anti-Zionist older Jews, there were critics of Netanyahu across the generations, that wasn't the dividing line. The dividing line was about Zionism itself, the idea that the Jewish people have a state of their own in the Middle East. That was the dividing line, which didn't necessarily divide according to generations. So that was the first recognition. The second thing was that anti-Zionists were not coming into the room at all. So they weren't there in the conversations. And if we were saying that the dividing or the division which is developing in North America is between Zionists and anti-Zionists, and we're there in order to enable these two sides to have dialogue, we weren't reaching the other side.
So before I go into what the report discovered, and I know you just touched on it now, can you, and I know this is very complicated, but the report at no point defines the word Zionism or the word anti-Zionism. I think it's important, so we know what we're talking about, to explain what those two words mean.
That's it. That's really interesting. I've heard that said a couple of times, and I think it was quite clearly defined. We asked 5 questions of the participants, and one of the questions was precisely aimed to get at that question. First of all, we were speaking to we knew that all the folks we were speaking to were very unhappy with what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Okay, that was a given. So we started from that given, and we said, bearing in mind, so we said, okay, do you believe, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you believe that Israel was a good idea that's gone badly wrong, or was a bad idea that is playing out precisely as we thought it would, because all settler colonialism leads to genocide? That, to me, is the clear definition of where critique of Zionism moves into anti-Zionism. when I think that the idea of the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, was a bad idea from the start and was inevitably going to lead to awful things, that's what I would define as an anti-Zionist. And someone who's a Zionist who may nevertheless be critical of Israel, is going to be higher up on that scale, is going to say Israel's a good idea, Zionism is a good idea, but I'm unhappy with the way that it's playing out. One thing to gauge is, what am I willing to do in order to change that situation? Like, how active am I? Or how vocal am I? And also, how much do I think that this is a theory, or do I believe it's actually going to happen? It's a little bit like believing in the Messiah, right? Yeah. Do you believe in the Messiah, and are you going to work to bring the Messiah about, or not? And in both directions, to what extent do I believe that Israel can return to the right path? And what am I doing in order to change it?
I mean, I remember when you were at Macom, you talked about the difference between battering and bettering, and you said, you know, that there's those who criticize Israel because they want it to be better, and there's those who criticize Israel because they don't want it to exist. And this seems to be an extension of that framework.
To an extent, or that, again, not wanting it to exist. I from what we were hearing from folks, it's more about, I'm going to use the word wishing it didn't exist, because there were several people we spoke to who said, I think it's a bad idea, I think it's awful, etc., etc. I'm not stupid enough to think that it's going to disappear tomorrow, or even expect it to disappear. So the difference between want and wish is probably important too.
Exactly. I noticed also in the report, there's a line that says, for the sake of argument, we take no stance neither on the nature or the value of the state of Israel. I'm just curious if you got any pushback for putting that sentence in the report. And I was a bit surprised to see that your organization takes no stance on the nature or the value of Israel.
But first of all, it was in the report, but it was actually in the introduction letter that we were sending to folks we hoped would meet with us. It's quite easy to stand by that. I think that both Abby and myself have spent 20 odd years working in Israel education, taking a stance on Israel. But for the sake of argument, we take a stance on the ability of the Jewish people to talk across difference. And we certainly haven't taken any stance on who's allowed to participate in those conversations or not. We were given feedback from the anti-Zionists that we met, who said, you know, guys, looking at your material, you do take a stance on Israel, because all your material is within a Zionist consensus, even though it's asking questions about Israel. And that was interesting to notice. But I think that's also an element of who we're working with.
So let's get into what the report found. So the report sort of challenges 4 assumptions that Zionists have of non-Zionists. The first being is that they don't know anything about being Jewish. The second is that they've been brainwashed by a woke ideology. The third is that they are looking to make nice with the goyim. And the last is that they don't care about the Jewish community or the Jewish people. And in the report, you challenge each of those assumptions. I really just want to focus on one, though, for the purpose of this interview, which is the second one, which is they have been brainwashed by woke ideology. When I speak to people who have criticisms of anti-Zionists, that's probably the one that I hear most, that there's no way that they could come to a logical conclusion that they come to without having been brainwashed by the woke, the left, Qatar funding on campus, that sort of thing. So talk me through what came up around that assumption.
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's not that we were challenging this assumption. It was that what we heard from these folks challenged the assumption. So our findings challenged that assumption, which to an extent, I'll admit that we had to an extent as well. Look, one of the important questions that we asked was the process or the journey that people took on the way to reaching their opinions, right? No one is born an anti-Zionist. No one is born a Zionist. We go on a journey. And so we were asking these folks, what were the milestones along their journey where they reached the point where they were saying 1 or 2 on the anti-Zionist scale. And in that, we just heard stories of folks who had grown up within the mainstream Jewish Zionist communities, had grown up with the assumptions and the beliefs of mainstream Jewish Zionism, and through their experiences had grown to find the narrative that they were taught either a lie or unsatisfactory. And that was how they reached their assumption. That was how they reached their conclusions.
Yeah.
And so if somebody who was doing protective presence in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, they were there because they were on a course on peace studies. They ended up there, being there and seeing their Palestinian host get beaten up, them getting beaten up by Jewish settlers, and appealing to the Israeli army for help, and the Israeli army didn't do anything. And I'm even talking about this specific example. Let's say that this is not representative of anything but that person's experience, which, as we know, isn't quite the case. That person experienced a really bad perspective on Israel and the Jewish people. The person that she was hosted by 1 month later got killed dead by a settler. She went home to America and couldn't find a rabbi or a leader in the Jewish community who was willing to speak to her about this and for her to speak to them about it. So what the folks that we met, their experience was both horror at the way in which they felt Jewish Israelis were behaving towards them and towards Palestinians, and rejection and alienation from the Jewish community in the United States when they brought up their experiences. Left to their own devices, these folks were going to be coming to different conclusions from the ones they'd been taught. They ended up looking at, let's call them, for the sake of argument, for woke understandings of Israel, anti-Zionist understanding of Israel, and they made more sense to them, bearing in mind their experiences. And so they certainly, a lot of them sound like they speak the language of what you might call woke ideology, but the way they reached those conclusions were not through brainwashing. They were through personal experience and a great deal of reflection. Again, the two important things to get about this research: A, the vast majority of the people we spoke to were older than 25. So they were not young, let's call them impressionable students. These were people who'd spent time developing their thoughts. And also the other thing is that the people that we spoke to were only the people who were willing to speak to us.
So then I guess there's a question is, did you speak to a representative sample of anti-Zionists who, it sounds like you spoke to more thoughtful ones that had already been, maybe had a Zionist education, come from deep within the Jewish community, had a bar bat mitzvah, that sort of thing. And maybe the criticism is of, a much larger number that their anti-Semitism doesn't come from, I just said anti-Semitism. Their anti-Zionism doesn't come from that place of going to the West Bank, doing protective presence, having that deep personal experience. Yeah,
look, first of all, I have no idea. I haven't done any quantitative research on this. And I'd say not many people have done specific quantitative research on this. I will say a couple of things, though. Since we've brought out the research, we've heard from two other researchers, one person who has spoken to 800 Jewish anti-Zionists, who was not sure as to how to or whether to publish her research, and now she will, who came across very similar stories. The other thing I'd say is that even looking at I'm going to call it the JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, recently came out with a survey. I was only looking at the young people. Okay, so of all the people that this JFNA survey covered, the folks who were, let me just get this right because I don't want to make a mistake here, between 18 and 34, okay, I'm an old bugger now, so 34 doesn't sound young to me. That's so 18 to 34-year-olds, 14% define themselves as anti-Zionist, 18% define themselves as non-Zionist. We were speaking to people who define themselves as anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. That of that age group, 32% define themselves as anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. That's 1 in 3, let's say 1 in 3 families. Now, that's a lot of people. Right. That means that everybody knows somebody.
Yeah.
We've also picked up from the 2 people who've been doing additional research is that this does terrible emotional damage within families.
Of course.
Right. I'll tell you another crazy statistic that comes out of the official JFNA numbers. One of the questions that they ask is, what is it? Is Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians? Okay. Is Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians? Come on, here's your guess. Of everyone that they spoke to, including those who define themselves as Zionist, all the people that the JFNA spoke to, what percentage would you say agree that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians?
I know the answer, so I won't answer it because I've read this. Yes.
You already checked it.
Yes.
38%. I mean, that's
extraordinarily high. Yeah.
So how representative are we? I don't know. But I think we know that it's at least representative of 1 in 3, 1 in 5 families across the United States. I mean, numbers, percentages are only one way of seeing how representative this is.
Yeah.
I know that. Sorry, go on.
Can I ask just as a personal question before I ask what we do with this data? How does that make you feel as an Israeli that 38% of American Jews think your country is committing a genocide?
It's funny. I've like yourself, I've been living in this reality for the last 2 years, so nothing surprises me these days. The percentages surprised me. But where I'm left is actually thinking that the Jewish community writ large, just like all societies writ large these days in the days of internet and social media and so on, is terribly atomized. And that means that groups, we start using words. If we're not speaking to each other, our understanding of words and our use of words start to develop differently in different directions. See, I truly do believe that I have a very different definition of what an understanding of what genocide means to a lot of other people. And to me, it means we need to be talking more to each other, not to lose track of meanings of ways that we communicate. Right? I think that there's a historical dimension to the use of the word genocide. There's a connection to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, which connects to the use of the word genocide. There's something about the way that the word genocide is applied back in history. If we are describing what Israel's been doing as a genocide, then how does that apply to every other war that there has been up until now? There are many, many questions about it, but I think it comes down to, I don't think there are many arguments between those who say that there's been a genocide or not genocide. I don't think there are many arguments about the facts. I think there are arguments about the words themselves. And we need to be talking more to make sure that I at least understand what you mean by that word and what I mean by that word. There are other words that we need to understand. We need to understand what peoplehood means. We need to understand what Judaism means, what Zionism means, what occupation means, what apartheid means. I don't think our arguments are about facts. I think our arguments are about our moral judgments which play out in the way we understand the different words. And to fix that, we got to talk.
Right. So speaking of the meaning of words, especially in the Australian context, obviously following the Bondi massacre at a Hanukkah party, where the two men who carried out that terror attack said that they were motivated by a desire to kill Zionists. And the people that they shot at a Hanukkah party, they didn't interview them and ask them definitions of words or where they stand on Hamas or anything like that. They just shot into a Hanukkah party. And I think for many Australian Jews feel that this isn't an academic debate that we're having in an ivory tower. Like the use of words like genocide, apartheid, colonizer, words that many anti-Zionists use, actually calls real and physical harm to Jewish communities in the sense that they legitimize attacks on synagogues and other Jewish institutions. Were you at all concerned about interviewing people that in a way you may be giving them a hechsher, you may be saying this is a legitimate view to have in the Jewish community when these words cause immense harm to so many Jews?
So two things. First of all, we only asked a couple of questions.
Yeah.
And we also committed to not giving any pushback whatsoever. We were just listening. If they wanted to hear our opinion, they had to ask for it specifically, and there needs to be a majority in the room that wanted to hear our opinion. So I don't know what they think about that. And the piece about legitimacy, I've never really fully understood it. So let me start by saying two things. Without doubt, another piece of the conversation which needs to come into the room is the effect of what people is saying, in particular in a world where anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is rearing its head and is manifesting itself through anti-Zionist action. But I'm just not sure how anyone can be absolutely clear when someone's action is causing something else, and whether my speaking to them or listening to them is going to make that situation any worse. I know that's, or put it this way, I'm not sure who's the person who's deciding which person I should speak to and which person I shouldn't, which person I'm legitimizing and which person I'm not. And I'm also not sure that there was any legitimizing or non-legitimizing. Let's talk about, again, the JFNA research.
Right.
Was that legitimizing, telling us here is the percentage of people who believe that? Or is that giving us an image of the reality that we need to face? But I get it. It's a very tough one.
Look, this is something Adam Lewis Klein actually wrote on Facebook today. For those that don't know him, he's part of an organization called the Movement Against Anti-Zionism, which is trying to, I guess, reframe, what we used to call anti-Semitism as saying that is primarily now caused by anti-Zionism. And he wrote this on Facebook today. He said, anti-Zionist Jews don't merely hold an uncomfortable opinion on Israel against the so-called pro-Israel Jewish community. They insert themselves into scenes of anti-Zionist abuse, harassment, and shaming, and shut down Jews who try to defend themselves. They systematically tell the public that Jews are faking their oppression, that Jews are liars and untrustworthy. Anti-Zionist Jews are deeply immoral. There is nothing to legitimize, nothing to sympathize with. Anti-Zionist Jews are agents of injustice. And he also made a post against your report, without making this specifically about him. What do you say to people who have that view about your report?
First of all, they're welcome to their opinion. Second of all, I recommend they read the report, because I know that I saw Adam Lewis Klein simply retweeted or forwarded or whatever you do on Instagram, something that someone else had made up using the colors of our report with no link to the report. So I think in the Jewish world today, however embattled we are and we are, we've got to be really, really careful about kicking people out of a discourse without checking that they're doing something awful, without maybe speaking to them or checking that that's what's going on. Adam Lewis Klein is on a campaign to clarify that there are those who hate Israel, and it's a hate form, and it's got nothing to do with Zionism. And I find his writing really interesting and really persuasive. He differentiates, he takes away the hyphen. He says anti-Zionism is one word because it isn't really anything to do with Zionism. But there are those who are anti-Zionism. And those were the folks that we spoke to. And I thought it was a real shame that that Adam did that, and that whoever made the Instagram post did that without reading or seeing what we were talking about. If he thinks that we are, I think the other thing that what I read in that, what you read out just there, is that there's a significant, this is basically what surprised us, that in that report, in that response, there was a significant amount of straw manning. To say that what all anti-Zionists have said across the board, across the spectrum extremism, that every anti-Zionist buys into the entire spectrum of things that have been said, is silly. And it's as silly as saying that what you believe is what Itamar Ben-Gvir believes, because you're both
Israelis. Yes.
Israelis. It's just not clever.
Yeah.
And Adam Lewis Klein is a clever guy.
So I guess that goes on to something you write in the conclusion of the report, where you say there's 3 options of where the community can go to now. It can go to community strengthening, which is, I guess, what Adam Lewis Klein is saying, like Catholics and Protestants, split this up into 2 different synagogues, 2 different denominations, make a sharp dividing line, you're in, you're out. Giltroy also wrote a piece on that today in the Jerusalem Post. Community educating, which is, coming to have a dialogue and that sort of thing, and community healing, which is the really, really hard work of what you talked about, what's happening in families where maybe the parent is Zionist and the child is anti-Zionist. Can you maybe talk through those 3 options a little bit more and maybe share the advantages and disadvantages of each approach?
Yeah, sure. So community strengthening, it depends which community you're talking about. And I would say that both pro-Israel and anti-Israel or anti-Zionist folks both believe in this approach. There are Zionists and there are anti-Zionists who believe in this approach, which is we cut out the people who are getting it wrong. They're doing damage, they're endangering us, we cut them out. Anti-Zionists are less capable of doing that because they are fewer in number and have less sort of control over the levers of power, whatever. But that approach is the approach of civil charity, according to Teresa Bejan, a woman who explored exactly those splits in the Christian world back in the 17th century. We just split. Right. The second approach, what we were talking about, is educating. That's not about dialogue. Educating is is teaching about Israel. Is Israel education that we've been doing and you've been doing for many years, and that we just need to teach people better how to remain in the consensus. We need to teach people about Israel better so that they won't become anti-Zionists. And likewise, anti-Zionists have a similar approach, that we need to teach people
Zionists better. Yeah,
that's right. The third approach, we started by saying, and this is the approach where, for the sake of argument work, that we need to heal these differences by talking amongst each other. Thinking it through again, we realized that we're not there yet. We don't really know what to do. We spoke to a really wise leader of a significant Jewish organization who put it very beautifully. And I think in the end, we roughly mention her approach at the end of the article.
Yeah.
There are two things that can't happen. One thing that shouldn't happen is that the Jewish people splits apart because of Israel. That would be awful. I mean, Zionism was around in order to save the Jewish people, not to split it into pieces. That would be dumb. So we can't, on the one hand, we can't have Israel being the thing that splits us. On the other hand, we can't have, the way to avoid the split is to ignore and remove any reference to the state of Israel from Jewish life, so as to make the anti-Zionists comfortable, right? Yeah. That is also impossible to imagine. Mm. And these two clashes, this paradox, we don't know how to solve it yet. And our take is that we've got to stay in conversation. We've got to hold ourselves together through this storm, unless or until some different way of doing this emerges. But I think we're not doing things right if we're saying we need to cut people out. And I don't think we're doing things right if we're saying we need to cut Israel out.
Yeah.
So we just got to keep talking.
Look, and the families that I know where there's maybe a Zionist parent and an anti-Zionist child, the way they deal with it is like what you said, they just don't talk about Israel. They make an agreement, Shabbat dinner, Pesach Seder, we can talk about everything, fashion, the food, the weather, what's on Netflix, no Israel. But at a certain point that becomes hard because maybe there's a picture of the Kotel on the wall, or maybe there's something happened, or there was a demonstration, or the clothing someone is wearing, someone else finds offensive. And it's given that Israel, for both Zionists and non-Zionists, is obviously a huge part of their Jewish identity, it's a very hard thing to not talk about it. So then if I go by your approach and you say, okay, this is something that does need to have dialogue, I guess my question is, if there's a parent who feels like on October 7th, Israel had no choice but to defend itself, and that the Chayalim who sacrificed their lives are heroes, and that Israel is put in an unfathomable situation, has made very tough choices, but has done what it needs to do to exist. On the other hand, speaking to a person that, calls the actions that Israel took after October 7th, the genocide, like, where do you start having that conversation? If you do want to talk about the elephant in the room, how do you even do that when the Zionist feels like the anti-Zionist, like every one of their arguments is fuel for the hatred and the delegitimization of the Jewish presence in America today?
That's easy. That's a joke.
Okay.
Look, so apropos the joke, there's not an easy answer, and it requires hard work, and hard work means also hard emotional work. And these are the workshops that we're developing and have been working with up until now, and are developing far more now. So to an extent, I think that we're talking about shared aims and techniques. I think we mentioned this in the report. If we see that the problem with my daughter or my father is their attitudes to Israel, that's going to make life quite difficult. If I see that the problem is that our family's falling to pieces, and both of us have something which is deeply precious to us that we can't let go of, that alters the aim of the conversation. Okay? And that links to a lot of our work where we try and differentiate between a debate, a negotiation, and a healthy argument. A debate is where I've got to convince you that you're wrong. A negotiation is where we need to agree at the end of the day. Too often, we're addressing these very arguments as if they're either debates or negotiations.
Mm.
And we know that doesn't work. I can't convince you that you're wrong because you're trying to convince me that I'm wrong, and we can't agree. And that means we need to move to a totally different set of tools for this healthy argument, where our aim is to, so in our workshops, we talk about our aim is to grow or to learn or to gain additional perspectives. But here, when we're talking about this terrible split at the heart of the family of the Jewish people, then the aim has got to be, we've got to stay together, our whole selves, and we need to talk about that. And we know that it's really unlikely we're going to convince each other, and it's really unlikely that we're going to agree. But we are a family. And there are many, so that's the aim, right? I believe that quite often simply clarifying that aim is of use. Then the next bit is the techniques that we use. And I mean, we advise lots and lots of techniques. There was, I think I'm going to throw in just one, right?
Yeah.
What we call is the yes but rule. A lot of the approaches of peacemaking, dialogue, bridge building, discourse, all that sort of stuff says that you must lead with curiosity. You need to learn how to listen well. And I would say that Abby and myself experienced the value of that on this tour. Sitting down with groups of people, and we forced ourselves not to say anything other than to listen. We said to everybody, you have to forgive our faces. They may give away stuff, but we're not going to say anything. That deep listening is really important. Because physiologically, I think it just opens my heart and my ears because I'm not putting myself in the conversation. And also it opens the other person's ears for what I might say if I'm showing that I've listened properly. That's the bit where I'm saying, have I understood you correctly? And I wait until I get a yes. It's what Resetting the Table, a brilliant organization in the United States, talks about, a bullseye reflection. But the but bit is, having made sure that I've understood you, I want you to understand me. And I'm now going to allow myself to tell you what I think and how I differ from what you have to say. I think it's rare that we do this process carefully. As in, before I tell you that I think you're wrong, or even before I tell you I think differently, I want you to know that I've heard you fully. I want you to tell me that I've heard you fully. And now I want you to understand me. And I think, so just one technique is, bearing in mind we're looking to hold our family together, understanding. I want to understand you, and I want you to understand me.
So, I mean, I've obviously, as a dialogue facilitator myself, I've used that techniques many times.
You don't know a thing about it.
Yes. But I guess the issue here is that when I see this happen in real time, what often happens is, when the Zionist maybe tells their story, the information that they're bringing comes from the Jerusalem Post and Alot Sheva and maybe Times of Israel. And then the person who is non-Zionist or critical is maybe getting the information from 972 Mag or Haaretz or Al Jazeera or other sources online. And so there's no shared information. You know, the version of events that the other is talking about, just they don't know about. They don't know about. One is not seeing, you know, the pain of the hostages, you know, who thankfully are now home, but or the pain of the Israeli soldiers or displaced people from the north and those sorts of things. And the other is not seeing the hungry children in Gaza and the settler violence in the West Bank. And so how do you have a dialogue, even using the yes but approach, when you don't have shared data, you don't have shared facts? How can you have that conversation?
Well, look, first off, you know, you're welcome to book a workshop with us, and we're going through it more. But without being facetious, I think that there's a difference when we, let me put it like this. I don't think it's about the facilitation about it. I think it's about the topic at hand, or that the job of the facilitator is to define the question that we're addressing. And what we need to do is raise that question up a level. When we're in the thick of all these details and counterfacts and facts, it's very difficult to find our way out. What we need to do is lift up a little bit and ask a higher question. For example, what's the value of a family keeping together? What's the value of the Jewish people? What's the value of unity? What's the nature of an innocent? These are questions which we call it toggling. It's not in order to avoid talking about the specifics, but for a little while, can we just talk about, do we share values? Are we talking about values? And most probably what's happening is that it's not that you have no values, it's just that you're valuing something different from what I'm valuing. And that already leads us into a more valuable conversation. Valuable conversation. It leads us into a different quality of conversation when we're talking about things that are important in the abstract, and then we can toggle back into the specifics and now talk about how they play out. And this toggling up and down, I think, is what's important. And that's where we get an understanding. Oh my God, when you say genocide, you mean something totally different from what I mean. And the implications of you saying that are very different from what the implications that I hear. I'm not necessarily going to solve that. But if I can hear that you're not a monster and that you don't hate me, that's not bad. And let's see what happens next time we have the conversation. I think we're a guy I had a great deal of respect for, Richard Siegel, of blessed memory. He used to say, you know, we've always got to make sure that you don't jump to a concussion. And I think that given this crisis that we're in, we're jumping for lots of concussions and keep banging our heads. And we've got to take it a bit more slowly, or we've got to give our expectations much more time.
Yeah. If I had to look into a crystal ball and say the impact of the Gaza war, I think that unfortunately it is going to lead to an almost permanent and maybe terminal split between Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews. I don't know that this is reconcilable, as much as I obviously work and believe and agree with much of what you're saying. Because I just think the gaps are too unbridgeable, or they feel too unbridgeable at the moment between, definitions of genocide, because genocide isn't just a word. Genocide is a thing that if someone is doing a genocide, you have to do everything in your power to stop that. It's not a let's live and let live. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. It's the most fundamental human behavior that is immoral to want to eliminate another people off the face of the earth, and to do that in the name of your religion and of your nationalism. So if that's what Israel is doing, it's a very hard thing to I guess coexist with that. But I guess my question is, what's your hope for the future? Where do you see the American Jewish community going in the next 10 years, and where do you want it to be on this question?
Oh God! Look, Itai, you got to remember, I'm half British and half Israeli, so the possibility of me reaching optimism is genetically impossible. But I hope we can. I hope we find better ways of speaking to each other and listening to each other. I hope we can get that far. I think it's far too soon to tell what are the implications of what's been going on in Gaza. It's too soon to tell. It's not over. And we don't know what the end game is. There are elections in Israel that are coming up, which may shift things entirely in one way or another. One of the questions that we didn't ask the anti-Zionists is, how would your attitude to Israel alter if overnight there's a Palestinian state, Gaza is rebuilt, and Israel becomes a pluralistic society? Would you remain on the side you're on or not? So many hypotheticals. There's going to be a war with Iran in a couple of weeks. Who knows where anything is going to end up? Who knows where the American community and the American society is, quite apart from the Jews? Our ability to talk to each other it's much easier to cut someone out than to have a painful conversation with them. And it's something that we learned from Ian Leslie, who wrote the book Conflicted. He once said to us, look, what's the value of talking to that lunatic? He says, I can't guarantee that anything will change if you have the top conversation with the lunatic or the person you believe to be a lunatic. All I can guarantee you is that if you don't have that conversation, definitely nothing will change.
Yeah. On that point, I wanted to thank you for your time and your honesty, and wish you behatzlacha for your work in the future.
Thank you, and you.